Hello and welcome to another edition of Positive Leadership, the podcast that helps you grow as an individual, a leader, and ultimately as a global citizen. One of the themes I want to explore more on this podcast today is the concept of meaningful time, the time we spend that truly matters in our lives. We're all on the same trajectory through time, but how we spend our time can vary drastically. Time and time management fascinates people, intrigues, and perplexes us in a way how we organize our lives while making time for the things that satisfy and fulfill us. That's an age-old question indeed. My guest today, Professor Ilona Boniwell, has extensively researched the relationship between time perception, well-being, and eventually happiness. Best-selling author, academic as well. She actually edited the first master's degree in applied positive psychology in Europe. She's one of the European leaders in that field of positive psychology. But she's also a coach, and she has developed her own approach to positive psychology coaching based on her findings and has delivered a program to thousands of coaches and top executives around the world using many tools and even some games we're going to talk a little bit about. So, such enormous pleasure to have you on the podcast, Ilona. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I know it's going to be fascinating in terms of your questions, discussions, so I'm delighted. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And looking forward to all the insights and incredible depths in the topics we're going to discuss. So you've been researching, studying, teaching, writing, coaching, consulting for over 20 years. And I believe you are trained under Martin Seligman, often referred to as the father of positive psychology. So can you tell us about the origin of your interest in positive psychology, how you discovered that field, and why? I'm also very interested, Ilona, always with my guests, on the why you have decided to dedicate your life to it.
Well, I was very fortunate to have discovered positive psychology in 1999, given that positive psychology only started in 1998. And I was very fortunate to discover it almost by chance, in fact. So at the time, I was still a young student studying psychology, psychology as usual, and organizing student congresses and conferences. So when I was just preparing to organize my first student congress for the British Psychological Society, I asked my team members, what should it be on? And somebody just came up with this idea, positive psychology. I went, so what's positive psychology? And he answered, this is Professor Alex Lindy, another really known person nowadays. And he answered, well, that's about the scientific study of happiness and well-being. What really makes sense to people and how people can thrive. And I went, oh my God, this is amazing. And so we did organize that conference on positive psychology. We organized another one a year later. And a year later, I had this surprise encounter because I was running yet another congress. That's 2001 now, so it takes a year to organize a conference usually. 2001, I keep running this student congress still. I'm just finishing my undergraduate studies and preparing for postgraduate, probably in clinical psychology. And I'm there all day long, and all day long there is this guy sitting and listening to all the presentations, and he's kind of not that young. And I wanted to come and ask him if he's a mature student and what brings him here.
You're curious.
Luckily, I didn't. Because at the very end of this conference, he comes and actually shakes my hand and said, thank you very much. That was really interesting. My name is Martin Seligman. Would you like to have a coffee with me?
And of course, you had heard about Martin Seligman at the time.
No, obviously. But you know, this is pre-Google, pre-knowing everybody's faces. So you just... And so we had that coffee.
Wow.
And he asked me this amazing question. What can I do to help you start positive psychology in Europe? I was like, okay, just keep asking. Well, we could bring together European congresses, we could bring together European network of positive psychology, etc., etc. I said, okay, well, go ahead and do it. And what happened for me in this moment is that up until that moment, I thought positive psychology could be a passion. That's fine. But it couldn't be a career. It couldn't be something I really would do fundamentally as a work. Just read about it, etc. I was going into clinical at that point. And really this moment shifted like the arrow from impossible to possible.
Wow.
And I went, why can't be a positive psychologist? I can. So I actually went ahead and studied and did my PhD. The only way at that moment was to do a PhD in positive psychology. And so this is how I became a positive psychologist.
So pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing in the sense that, one conversation with one person, with one question.
With one question.
One question set you on that mission for your life.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Absolutely. I had a couple of those conversations in my life, this one question, but the importance of one question.
Yes.
So when we think about coaching, for example, it's very often not about the formal coaching session, in fact.
Yes.
It is sometimes about asking this really important question in the right moment.
To make you reflect, to make you think deeply about it.
Exactly, which is why actually the management coach posture or leadership coach positioning is so effective or can be so effective. It's about asking those questions in those micro moments of time.
Love it, and it's a theme, Ilona, we've been discussing quite a lot on that podcast with a couple of guests, including my friend Michael Bungestani as well, on coaching habits. One area of research that interests you greatly, I think, is perceived time use and time perspective. Can you explain to me the different time perspectives and build them out a little?
Of course. In fact, when we talk about time, there are lots of different theories and the concepts. And actually, in fact, to really understand somebody's time, you need to probably dive into all of them. But I have a couple of preferred ones. So one of them is this notion of time perspective. Time perspective is a notion that was originally developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and really picked up by somebody called Philip Zimbardo. So the same Phil Zimbardo, with Stanford Prison Experiment, etc., who really researched it quite substantially over the past 30 years. And so the notion of time perspective, it's really about where do you position your thoughts at any given point in time. Are you more focused on the future, on the here and now, on the present, or on the past? In fact, we're talking about 5 different time perspective profiles. So the future time perspective is really about constantly thinking, what next? Next goals. I completed something. Tick off the box. Next.
Coming week, coming year,
etc. The present time perspective has 2 orientations. The present hedonistic, which is really about enjoying the present moment. So let's say you have a really important meeting tomorrow, and you have a really great party tonight. So do you go to bed early because the meeting is really important?
Or do you enjoy the night?
Or do you enjoy the party because we only live once, right? That's present hedonistic. Present fatalistic, it's also about being oriented to the present, but more in a sense that there is nothing you can do to control the future. So fatalistic, it means there is nothing I can do to change what's going to come. So what's the point in trying? So let's just, I don't know, keep playing video games, for example, because there is nothing else to do, right? And then you have 2 past orientations as well. So past positive. Past positive is really kind of bringing back lovely memories,
good memories, nice memories,
nostalgic sometimes, slightly nostalgic, sort of really continuing the tradition, connecting with family, friends, usually having lots of friends who come from the age of 5, etc. And then past negative, it's all the same, but mainly focusing on the negative events from your past, and actually having those memories spontaneously coming
back in your mind.
Exactly. And so your time perspective is actually where do you spend most of the time. And so one of my passions is to understand what's the relationship between time perspective and well-being. And in fact, research shows that, let's say, present hedonistic time perspective is associated with some aspects of well-being, with positive emotions, but not necessarily with life satisfaction, because, you end up doing some things that you might regret afterwards. The past positive time perspective is also really helpful for well-being, because there is a sense of continuity, temporal continuity that you actually sort of bringing with you. And future time perspective is kind of a hit and miss a little bit, because there are some aspects associated with well-being and some not too much, because also future time perspective very often leads us to be far more workaholism oriented, and not necessarily taking enough time for ourselves
to enjoy the day.
And of course, you'll probably ask me the next question, like, can't we have all of the above?
Oh, of course.
Right? And in fact, we can. So the notion of the balanced time perspective is really about being capable to flexibly shift between this focus on the past, on the present, past positive, present hedonistic,
Yeah.
and the future, depending on the current situational demands. So when you have this family in France, it's a great idea to be in the past.
Yeah.
When you are working, it's a good idea to be in the future. But when you finished working, it's a really good idea not to be in the future anymore.
Right. Yes.
When you're falling asleep
Yeah.
and not going through your list of
back
things
to
to do for
to-do
tomorrow,
list, yes.
etc. It's a good idea to
Yeah.
actually focus on the present moment.
Yeah.
So it's a capacity, it's cognitive flexibility, and this capacity to shift between these sort of temporal zones, which does also affect the way we use our time.
No, it's a great framework to actually reflect again whenever we can, and that's something else we'll discuss, and how we can enable ourselves to understand where we navigate in our mind on those 5 spaces.
Absolutely.
Because in many ways our Western culture places a strong value on future time perspective,
Very.
working towards future goals, rewards, often at the expense of present enjoyment. And as we know, it's not enough to fulfill us and bring us satisfaction, and that, like so many facets of our life, balance is the key. So how do you coach people to truly create a more balanced time perspective? So they are not confused about those 5 spaces.
In fact, there are different ways to measure time perspective. So actually measuring would enable me to position somebody already where they are at. And really the start of the coaching here is to understand where the person is at. So because the coaching would be very different for somebody who is really high on the future time perspective, or somebody, let's say, who doesn't have or have very, very low level of future time perspective, for example. So if somebody is really high, my coaching would be much more focused on the balancing it out with the present, on enabling, for example, to take time, enabling themselves to sort of allowing themselves, giving permission to take time, to enjoy, sometimes even just working out what does it mean to enjoy. What does it mean? What does pleasure actually mean to you? What is pleasure? Etc. So, and very often somebody with a really high future time perspective will always be in this constant optimization trap. Thinking that they can optimize better and better
all
and
the
better.
time.
Absolutely. And they'll be really, really passionate about all the time management tools. But that's precisely what they don't need to do. But they'll be really, really susceptible. So I can do it better, and I can do it even faster.
So they never satisfy themselves, right? They're never satisfied by what they can do.
Exactly, because you can always go much faster and much better and optimize even more. And somebody who doesn't, let's say, have a really well-developed future time perspective, the focus is completely different. It's sometimes about setting goals. I remember I had a very first coaching client. I had a sort of funny, interesting sort of situation. I remember I was like being trained as a coach at the time, and I was in front of her saying, so tell me, what goal would you like to work on? And she looks at me and says, do you know, I understand the word goal, but I do not get it. I don't understand what it actually means to have a goal or to set a goal. Well, I had a great coaching experience.
Must have been a very interesting discussion.
Exactly. So that's a really good example of somebody who doesn't have a really well-developed future time perspective. So the focus will be completely different.
So let's keep building on the discussion, Ilona. In your fantastic book, Positive Psychology, Coaching the Workplace, you introduce the notion of time crunch, the feeling of being rushed, and some alarming, although not terribly unsurprising data, that 61% of the population reported never having excess time. So is this phenomenon of feeling rushed a new phenomenon? And have we got less time now? Or do you think it's actually more about increasing demands on our time?
What's really interesting is that recent research actually suggests that there are even more people feeling time crunch or time famine. So we're talking about 70% or even 80% nowadays. So this number is growing really rapidly.
Keeps growing,
Absolutely. So it's a relatively new phenomenon, new in the sense of the couple of 2-3 decades sort of old. So we're not talking about really, really old phenomenon. And it's what is really interesting about it is that this phenomenon, this time crunch, does not necessarily correspond to time use data that sociologists, for example, collect. So when we look at how many hours people objectively work, and we usually ask them to complete time diaries, and we can actually measure the amount of hours, there is a real sort of difference between how much people work, and they work actually less overall, and what they think
The
how
perception
much
of the
they
time
work.
they spend, yes.
Exactly,
Yeah.
the perception
Yeah.
of time.
Yeah.
And so this is really, really interesting paradox, absolutely
Yes.
amazing, stuff, fascinating. And what's really interesting that even though people in fact work less, they feel they work more. So their perception
Yes.
of time famine, of time crunch is really important. And this perception is actually linked to their stress levels. So even though this perception is not real,
Yeah.
the outcomes are real.
Yes.
So, etc.
So this is where data matters a lot, in a way,
Absolutely,
right? To
absolutely.
really measure time,
Exactly.
which I'm a big
Absolutely.
believer of.
And what's
actually.
happening very often
Yeah.
is that why we have this increased perception of time crunch is because nowadays we cramp many more activities into the same unit of time.
Yep.
So we have many more emails that we try to answer, many more phone calls,
Yep.
or many more meetings, etc. So our perception of our time is our time is kind of
Dense and-
so dense and so
Yes.
full that this is what's producing this perception
Yeah.
of time crunch.
Yes.
And what's more,
Very
we
interesting.
continue crunching huge amount of activities into our leisure time as well. So it's not only related to work, but also to leisure.
Yeah.
Before, people used to just play golf
Yeah, yeah.
on a Saturday.
Yeah.
And now you have to bring your kids to one activity and then do the shopping
Yeah.
and then...
Or you do your workout and you listen to my podcast.
Exactly. well, podcasts actually are quite useful because
Yeah.
that's one of the solutions for
Really?
the so-called sort of time, wasted time we
Yeah.
don't like. For
Yes.
example,
Yeah.
when you are, let's say, waiting for the plane
Yes.
boarding, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
great time to listen to a podcast, right?
Anyway, my comment was,
Yeah.
obviously encouraging my listeners to use the meaningful time they have to
Absolutely.
to listen to podcasts. As you well know, Ilona, a number of management gurus have developed methodologies to be more productive. I mean, and of course, a very famous one, author by David Allen, is built on 5 simple steps: capture, clarify, organize, review, engage. And Franklin Covey, the famous Franklin Covey, packaged this into a daily and weekly planner.
Absolutely.
And all of that, of course, is based on this all-time bestseller author, Stephen Covey,
Yeah.
of The 7 Habits of Very Effective People,
Absolutely.
where he demonstrated how a paradigm shift can help you achieve the big things in your to-do list while managing the little things.
Absolutely.
His philosophy consists in enabling people to have a deeper engagement with their lives. So my question is, what is your advice about the practical steps people can take to plan their time so that they reach that level of well-being and satisfaction? It's something I'm confronted all the time myself. I'm coaching young entrepreneurs, impact entrepreneurs, and they are giving all of their lives to their mission, to that impact they want to see in the world, and yet they are so much stressed about that future, that present. They talk less about the past, I would say. It's more the present and the future.
Which is a shame, actually.
Yeah, it's a very good point. But at the end of the day, it's about discussion about what should they do, how can they actually shape their time in a way that is meaningful.
Okay. Well, I wish I could give you just one piece of advice, and I cannot. The reason I cannot is because fundamentally, there's many psychological variables. One size does not fit all.
No, of course.
So it's really about understanding one's own time traps, fundamentally. For somebody, a time trap can be over-motivation.
Yeah.
And believing they can absolutely do everything
every
and
day, all
every
time.
day,
Yeah.
and they can function at their personal best all the time.
Yes.
For somebody else, time trap could be, in fact, being very scared to be overstretched, for example, etc. So it's first of all, it's about understanding your own time traps. That's one, I would say. Second, I think it is about shifting the mindset and the value system
Yep.
in terms of what is the value we give to money and time. And fundamentally, what we do know, people who are more satisfied with their time are actually giving more value to time than to money.
Than to money.
So
yeah.
that's a really quite important shift. It's also about not valuing as much being busy, because being busy is a status symbol nowadays.
Of course. Yes.
And it's about letting go of that. And that's a really difficult one. I must
Yes.
admit, I've been working on time for the past 20 years. And when people ask me, how are you? I keep saying busy. And then, no, stop saying busy. Stop saying. Anyway,
Busy, yeah, of course.
exactly. It's also about giving time. Because funnily enough, research demonstrates that by giving time, we actually have a perception of having more time as well.
And you mean giving time to others or giving time to yourself as well?
As well.
Okay.
Giving time to others.
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely.
Yes, it's important.
It is also about, of course, balancing your time perspective. Of course, it is also about ditching things that don't bring pleasure, fundamentally enjoyment or meaning, and really being sometimes quite harsh in terms of what it is that you ditch.
Yes.
Sometimes I do a sort of very simple exercise with people on using a time bucket. You just pick up any kind of cap, for example, and ask people to fill it with little post-its of everything they do, and ask them, do they actually fit? Is there anything that doesn't fit? What doesn't fit? Would you like to take it out? How can I take it out? Is there anything that's not there that should be there? That's something that's meaningful and important for you that is not in your time bucket. What would you like to add? How? Very simple conversation sometimes producing some really interesting outcomes. So it's not one size fits all. It's understanding your time personality and fundamentally constantly working on alignment, between your, of course, values and what's really important to you and what it is that you are doing on a daily basis. And of course, not really falling too much into time management tricks, fundamentally.
No, it's actually very interesting in terms of starting understanding your own time patterns and your time diagnostic in a way before changing and shaping a bit differently your time.
Absolutely. Just because fundamentally behavioral change is always difficult.
It's 1% at a time.
Yes, and if it's not based on understanding of the current patterns, it wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work. I agree with you. So moving away from time slightly, I want to talk to you about well-being and engagement. You've looked at the importance of both well-being and engagement in tandem to create a positive and productive workplace. So can you expand on your ideas of well-being and engagement, how you measure them, what coaching tools you use to foster these two key components?
Of course. So there is sometimes a mistaken perception. Should I say it a little bit differently? There is sometimes this belief that well-being, engagement, thriving, flourishing, it's all the same thing. It's not.
It's not.
It's not. And what's really sometimes very helpful is to understand the differences between these notions, understand why they're important in a different way as well, and of course to measure them. So broadly speaking, when we're talking about well-being, or well-being in the workplace, we are talking about satisfaction. Is to what extent people are satisfied, for example, with their work they're doing, with their workplace, and to what extent they have more positive emotions than negative emotions. And it's a really important variable, which also does correlate and predict performance. When we're talking about engagement, we are talking about people going beyond their current role. It's not so much about how happy they are with it, but to what extent they're able to really identify with the organization and give sometimes more than it's necessary.
Is it a sense, in a way, it's a sense of belonging as well?
It is also a sense of belonging. It's a sense of really being absorbed in what you're doing. It's really a sense of alliance with your organization, etc. So it's a more active component of thriving, I would say. And so we can really distinguish these two. Both contribute to performance, for example, but saying that engagement contributes slightly more to performance than well-being. And what we are ideally looking for, we are looking at the really sort of good high levels of both well-being and engagement. Why? Because engaged people can be performing very highly for a while. There will come a time when they will not be able to, simply because they don't recover. When we are talking about well-being, in the absence of engagement, there is a danger that the person can slip towards more the 9-to-5 mentality. That's my well-being, these are my boundaries, I need to recover. Well, whatever happens here, I need my well-being time. And so sometimes in the extreme of well-being, the engagement may be missing. So what we are looking for, we are looking for sustainable performance, which will be comprised from both engagement and well-being. And of course, we can measure it. We can measure it through emotional data. We can measure it through cognitive data. I can, like, for example, explain some of the models in terms of different versions of well-being, cognitive level well-being that we can measure. So we can measure productivity productivity, engagement, satisfaction. We can measure more sort of attitude towards relaxed work, or even boredom, etc., etc. So we can measure all the different cognitive well-being states by using validated questionnaires, for example. And this is something relatively straightforward nowadays. It's something that we know how to do. We know how to capture this type of data. But your second question, of course, was, what do you do?
Yes, what do you do about it? Exactly.
Okay, we know somebody is kind of somewhere close to workaholism, is a little bit very engaged, and well-being is not quite there. What do you do? And well, again, I wish the answer was simple. Again, let's press the button and everything works. It's not, because for that we need to look at the predictors of well-being engagement, for example, in the workplace, and there are many. For example, in our model, positive organizational profile, we identify approximately 18 major predictors of well-being engagement, and they will be predicting well-being and engagement slightly differently. So sometimes you would actually start with a different indicator, different predictor, depending on the situation. So the answer is to find what are the most important predictors in this particular context, what it is that we are looking to increase. Is it well-being, is it satisfaction, is it engagement, etc.? What is it that we are looking perhaps to decrease? And then depending on the predictor, let's say the difficulty here is at the lower level of vitality because people have been really exhausted, or the difficulty here is perhaps middle management not quite knowing what posture to adopt, or perhaps not having had sufficient training, for example, and just specialists being put into management roles. So depending on the predictor, the answer of what it is that we can do would be very different.
It can be very pointy based on, again, this diagnostic. Both of a person, I guess, of a team or an entire organization. What is the plan you should have, actually, to get to
and I think there is a danger in just prescribing general solutions without understanding the actual cause of the issues,
the root cause,
and at the same time without understanding what it is that's working well. Because sometimes some of the fundamental drivers, and this is where positive psychology differs from a traditional problem-solving model, right? We also need to take into account what is working well.
What is working well, absolutely.
What is working
what gives you energy.
What gives energy, and how can we actually build more of that? And how can we take the examples of our organization, a team that functions particularly well, and perhaps sort of use their practices, use their rituals for the rest of the organization.
Yeah, super. So you've got a number of games and tools, a lot of fancy things on the table. Can we have a go at trying one of them?
Absolutely. What would you like to try?
Tell me what you have in store.
Well, we
briefly, and then we can pick one of them.
We can start with strengths cards, for example, and that's a straightforward exercise to do. We can look into positive actions, which is really about positive psychology interventions, which are appropriate for at an individual level, or even look at workout. But here I have 180 practices for positive organizations. So maybe that's a bit long, right?
What about the strengths card? It looks like more straightforward conversation. Hopefully, we'll see. Never played that game, by the way, to the listeners. So.
Well, let's try to do that, right?
Let's discover that, yes.
So what we have here, let's try to do a little stuff, I would say coaching demonstration, etc. So what we have here, we have stuff different strengths cards, specifically 50 different strengths cards. Let's just perhaps spread them out.
50, okay.
50 different strengths cards. They are informed, the development of these cards was informed by the comparison between all existing strengths inventories. So in fact, I think it's probably the most comprehensive set of cards that you could potentially find. And I'm going to just do a couple of exercises with you. You can see lots and lots of different cards. You might want to just look around at them, etc. And I'm going to ask you a couple of very simple questions, right? Which is, there we go. We have 50 cards spread approximately on the table. If you were to have a look around, could you possibly try to identify 2 or 3 cards which really represent your top strengths? And what I mean by strengths, strengths is something where you feel authentic. So it's really kind of, that's me, the spontaneous sort of recognition. I'm sure that's me. It's something where you feel the energy. So when you do it, when you use the strengths, you actually end up being more energized, and you don't end up being depleted. Right?
Yes.
So that's really important. And of course, it's something that you're good at.
Yes.
But good at in itself is not sufficient. because good at is great, but they're also good at in many competences, so learned behaviors. As we progress through our career, we become pretty good at quite a lot of things.
It's not about being good enough.
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Exactly. So it's really good at, really good at, fundamentally. And the energy. The energy is really important thing here. It's because when we're talking about competences, we are good at it, but the energy part is missing. I don't know, let's say you have developed a good capacity to be a listener and you can listen really well, but you come out of a listening session, let's say, and you feel, I'm tired. So that's not a strength, for example. Yes. So something that you are really confident that it is your strength. And once you have found this kind of couple of chords, couple of strengths that you're really confident you really have them, I would like you to give me a story that illustrates an example, a practical example of using that strength.
Wow, those are big questions, Ilona, and a lot to think about, because I'm just contemplating for you on the podcast like 50
yes, I know.
50 cards.
You can move them around.
Critique, equality, open-mindedness, social connection, time optimization. Actually, we talked about resilience, detail, courage, curiosity, harmony, hard work. I mean, love, action, kindness. Anyway, wow. So much to contemplate, and it's pretty hard exercise, as you all know, to reflect on yourself, because as you may know, I think we discussed that together. I did this exercise with Kim Cameron, which was the best self-portrait. But what was easier for me is that I get the feedback from others, not from me, who told me their stories about, hey, I think this is where JP's strengths came to life. Yeah. And now I have to think about that with my eyes, which is... So let me maybe take a couple of minutes to just pick those 2 or 3 things and reflect on it.
There could be a version of this exercise where we would go through all of these cards.
Really?
And you would have to sort it into, is that your strength? Is that your competence? Or is that your potential?
Wow. How many days do you spend on that?
No more than half an hour, surprisingly enough.
Okay.
And if you don't find a strength, you can use a green joker card.
Oh, you get a joker card. I have no strengths at all. No confidence in myself.
So how are you doing?
Well, I'm perplexed, of course.
It's just 2 or 3 strengths. Yeah. You might have 7 or 10 signature strengths.
No, not that many, but...
I'm sure you do.
I'm just trying to pick new things, yes. Yes. Okay. Maybe let me give it a go and try.
Yes, please. Okay.
So I selected 3 cards. Leadership, learning, teamwork.
Perfect. So could you give me a story for each of them, please?
Wow, okay. And indeed, I could have different stories for each one of them. And let's start with one. Leadership is certainly something I got to learn, to actually even understand the concept of leadership by doing it, by being a first-line manager at Microsoft in my 25, 26 years old age at the time. And since that time, I've been enjoying so much, I think, what I'm calling the privilege to be a leader. And by the way, I think that anyone can be a leader. I don't mean you need to be promoted to be promoted to be a leader, but not to get back to maybe a story, because that's the exercise. Clearly, one of the maturity story in a way of my leadership style evolution as well has been the story of what I learned at Microsoft, outside of Microsoft, in the sense of what it takes to transform an organization to a different mission. And story at Microsoft is that 8 years ago we're a software company. We're building some great software for customers. We had a mission at the time, which was to that one day there will be actually a PC on every desk in every home. But we thought that was not enough, and that was not relevant anymore in a way in the world we're living in. And so as a company, we embark on transformation, And long story short, with a new mission to empower every person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. Which means back in 2015, 2016, that we were considering changing, rewiring Microsoft completely to become a cloud and AI first company. And I was in charge of the sales force of the company at the time, the global sales force. And in many ways, it was about asking 35,000 people across the planet to evolve from being great sellers of software licenses to our customers, to companies, to businesses, to become actually the trusted advisor to customers to their digital transformation. And that's like a gigantic reinvention of yourself. And at the time, I decided, and I'm going to make this long story a shorter one because I discussed a little bit of that in some of the podcast episodes, particularly with Michael Bunge-Stani on coaching. I decided to try to train and learn myself how to become a coach, so that I could learn myself the new skills needed for all the 35,000 people to be successful. And I decided to jump and dive into that learning, very uncomfortable space of changing my behaviors, of rewiring the skills, but the hard skills, but a lot of soft skills, on how should I change the way I manage people, the way I live with people across the globe, to become myself a trusted advisor, and to get them to grow and to show them that they have the ability in themselves, with a lot of very incredible smart people, to reinvent themselves as a trusted advisor of the customers. So that's maybe the story which could go on and on and on of leadership, where the way I think about leadership and the way I think about leadership being hopefully trying to be a role model, exemplary yourself, and kind of doing what you're asking your people to do, and being in the middle of the trenches as well.
Yeah. That's beautiful, and I can hear already another of your strengths coming through the story.
So maybe learning, it's a little bit of learning, but I'm going to take another story for learning. I love learning. I think I love learning for many, many, many years in my life, decades in many ways. In a way, I learned from my dad, who I could see himself reinventing himself in his life as a doctor, and after I retired, becoming an author of a book and building wonderful models as well, doing some modeling, a lot of things. And he was learning Spanish, learning new things when he was retired. He has a new life. And I said, wow, that's kind of actually exciting and inspiring. And so all along my career, but probably even more so, I must admit, I was not necessarily great at that for many years. I decided to invest and dedicate more of my time now, for sure, a lot more, to all the change makers in the world. The people we call social entrepreneurs, we call these days them impact entrepreneurs. And so for the last decade, in a way, I've been spending voluntarily a lot of more time connecting with such people, learning from them, learning from the great role models, from the founder of Ashoka, Bill Drayton, I had on my podcast actually, to many incredible social entrepreneurs, change makers in the world, to learn, number one, what has been driving them to do that, to dedicate their life, back to our discussion before on time and purpose. Wow, those people are purpose-led big time. And then to learn from them what it would take to actually use that energy to build my own foundation with my family, which I did 7 years ago, called If For Good. And what I did there was, and keeps going, an incredible learning community, where I keep learning both from the coaching session I'm having with some young entrepreneurs, because they, I learn as much as hopefully they learn from me as well, but also with the beneficiaries of all their causes and enterprise they do, which are wonderful, whether it is people with handicaps or people with, who are recycling plastics to have a more sustainable society. So long story short, I love learning. That will be another story. I'm going to stop there. And just the session we have right now with the two of us, is all about learning. I'm fascinated because I met with a few of your peers, as you know, in the US, in Europe as well. And each one of you is bringing me some new facets of that positive psychology, positive leadership, which I love. I love and keep building on it.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And I could listen to your story and keep listening.
I think the third card I picked, and again, there's so many vibrancy, many other cards, I would say, is teamwork. And why did I pick teamwork? Because I think since very young, actually with my favorite sports, which is football, I mean the real football, not soccer, I mean, but the same thing. I've loved always being part of the team. And I was young, playing in a football role as a libero at the time. It was the technical term for that role of a player. And then all along my business career as well, being in the middle of the teams, shaping teams, creating not just high-performance teams, but high-purpose-led teams. Create teams that reinvent themselves. And I gave you an example, Microsoft on the other card, but in a way, I'm kind of trying to do the same with my own foundation today. I've got a young team and a very diverse team who is kind of incredible, and being able to hopefully inspire them, to coach them, and to inject a number of the learnings I had all along the ways, so that they create by themselves very thoughtful and very driven teams, where they can bring the best of themselves every day in what they do, and they love what they do. So, talk about engagement and well-being. I can see the 2 blocks being there all the time. And that gives me so much energy. It gives me energy when I'm in the middle of the team and showing and seeing that team growing, months after months, a year after, and you see what they do and say, wow, this is so amazing. And how much more they do than by yourself. And I think that's what gives me energy, and that will be the last example I share with you.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your strengths. And you can see perhaps, obviously you are the one talking, when people talk about their strengths, they change the way they talk.
Physically.
So their voice becomes different, they become far more confident, affirmative, their gestures become different, they use their body language differently. So what happens very often with this type of exercise, I would usually do it in a group. I would do it in a group of people, usually people who know each other.
That'd be
so
great.
the team members, for example.
Yes.
And what happens is that when people talk about their strengths, everybody wants to listen.
Of course.
Because these are great stories. These are interesting stories. These are stories that actually make sense.
Yes.
And then there is another round usually when all the people talked about it. And this is really can work very well when people know each other well.
Yes.
Then I would ask people to also give other strengths to the same person.
Yes.
And actually build on the story and go perhaps a little bit further in the story. And of course, then it's much better if you know each other well. So at the moment, I'm looking for a couple of strengths that I would love to give to you.
Ah, really?
But I do, obviously with the limitation that I don't necessarily know you that well. So the strengths I'm looking is one of them is personalization, for example. And the reason I would give you personalization is just listening to you and having had a couple of conversations, is that you are extremely good in learning about people, really in adjusting and really asking just the right questions. So, for example, you've done great homework in preparing for this interview with me, as you were with other people on your podcast, and you keep changing the questions to actually get more and more and more to the point, and more and more precise. And that's a really great strength of personalization.
Thank you.
I'm hearing in our conversation. And another strength I'm looking for, which I can't find,
but you know them all.
because there are so many of them right now, but I'm going to pick up a joker. Okay. It's actually strengths of spirituality.
Of what?
Spirituality.
Okay.
It is there somewhere, but so I'm picking up a green card for the time being. And the reason I picked up spirituality is that when we talk about it's not necessarily about any religious heritage, it's really contributing to the world and this world awareness. Because on numerous occasions when we talked, you keep coming back to this positioning of me and the world and the importance of interaction between me and the world, whether it's through the ecological awareness, for example, or leadership consciousness. So I think that's another absolutely amazing strength of yours, and we will find the card at some point.
Wow, thank you so much. Ilona.
And sorry.
Love it, and wonderful, and I believe like you that I think doing that with a team and people who know you, I think is a wonderful way to to start really building on your strengths.
Absolutely.
Which I believe is a core fundamental of that philosophy of leadership as well.
And what's really important is not to do this type of exercise just as a one-off, because what usually happens in a team, eventually everybody cries. So this I can promise,
yes,
and the hug and
sure.
etc. Et yes. So this is great. But actually not to stop there, because where we do really see changes in the way we lead, in the way the team functions, is when this language of strengths becomes integrated.
Yeah.
So it's not just something you do to make people feel good, which is a part of it, of course.
Yes.
It's really about using the strengths and reconstructing the way our teams function, for example, on the basis of understanding of each other's strengths.
Of each other's, yes.
So what are your best strengths? Because we know that if we adjust our work tasks to our best strengths, not just to our competences, and especially not to our weaknesses, and manage to really align the tasks that we do, the projects that we're responsible for, with our best strengths,
this is so powerful.
We get the optimal situation of really full engagement and well-being, and people being fully flourishing in their work roles. So it's important not to stop here and keep building on that dynamic of understanding and integrating strengths into functioning.
So, Ilona, I was talking to Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever, on a podcast a few months ago, about the need to scrap the old leadership paradigm of command and control in favor of a more collaborative servant leadership approach, which puts a greater emphasis on purpose, impact, and well-being at work. There's no question that we need a new leadership model. I'm very convinced of that, particularly given the impact and trauma of COVID, and all people are reflecting on that. And you've been using an acronym to describe the issues relating to today's workforce, VUCA, VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Can you talk about some of these workplace changes that you are seeing as a consultant, as deep engaged, coach of those organizations, that you've seen having an effect on well-being and how positive psychology coaching can help? And please, of course, in the discussion, if you also can share a practical tool you've used success during the pandemic and after, that'd be great.
Of course. Yes, of course. We can almost say that VUCA has intensified with the pandemic. So it's been VUCA already for quite a while, and became just much more VUCA, right? so changes are just so rapid. It's so difficult to plan. It's so difficult to even interpret the data coming back from the environment, etc. So what we are seeing, of course, we are seeing much more stress overall. Stress linked to this unpredictability, ambiguity, very often increased workloads sometimes, or perceived increased workloads as well. So we are seeing much more social isolation for some parts of the working population. So we know during COVID, there were people who were more affected than others. So younger people got far more affected than older people, and especially younger people, females sometimes.
Living on their own as well.
Living on their own, etc. Males as well, in fact, depending on the demographic situation. So we are seeing a lot more isolation. And what I found really striking was the difficulty that some younger people have engaging even in face-to-face online meetings. They're there, but they're no longer showing the face. I remember one of an interesting training sessions for one of the big consulting companies where I was training younger talents on emotional intelligence. And I was really struggling to get them to switch their videos on, because
videos are off, or they're an avatar, or they
exactly. So we're talking about emotions. We kind of really do need to see the faces.
It'd be nice.
Well, obviously we are seeing the whole trend of the Great Resignation and people losing fundamentally the meaning or projection towards the future, especially with the same companies, etc. We are seeing also trends of now difficulty of bringing people back to the office. So what is the office actually offering to people to bring them back?
What is the
What's
reason?
the point?
What's the point of being back? Yes, exactly.
So many, of course, and we can continue. So in our work, what we found perhaps the most important over the last few years really was to focus on resilience fundamentally and on meaning, I would say, and also on some aspects of well-being as well, of course, in our work. So the reason resilience, because how do you not just cope with stress, but how do you finally thrive
Yes.
under VUCA conditions and increased stress. So we've been using a lot of the program called Spark Resilience with many leaders and teams and individuals all around the world.
What is it? Can you just explain a little bit on Spark
Yes,
Resilience?
of course.
Yeah?
Spark Resilience is a program that I originally developed about 12 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
Originally, it used to be a program for kids.
Interesting.
So basically bringing together lots of positive psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy skills for the children.
Yep.
And then the program grew up faced with a demand from the workplaces, etc. And actually grew up even more with COVID when got adapted to online environments and at the same time picked up even more skills. So what Spark is an acronym explaining the process of resilience itself. It's also an acronym that enables us to attach different skills associated with resilience in such a way that to make it easier for people to remember and to use. So Spark stands for stress, perception, affect, response, and knowledge. So a stressful situation is always interpreted. So let's say I'm late for our meeting and I don't have your phone number to call and I'm stuck in traffic. I'm feeling stressed, but why am I feeling stressed? Well, because my interpretation would be, oh, I should have left earlier, for example. So this interpretation and not a stressful situation would produce certain affect, the feelings and emotions inside of me, for example, certain reaction, what it is that I do, and certain learning that I actually will take from that situation. And so when we work on the development of resilience, we work on development of different types of skills. So when we target P, the perception, we are working on the development of cognitive skills, cognitive skills of how do you change that perception. So the cognitive skills may be decatastrophizing, for example, or it may be cognitive diffusion, or it may be reframing. So in A, we'll be working on skills associated with emotion management.
I see.
So
managing your own emotions,
exactly. Labeling emotions, for example, is a really powerful strategy, or using mindfulness, for example. In R, we'll be working on skills associated with behavior, so more behavior change, so things like, for example, assertiveness skills or goal-setting skills. And in K, we'll be working on more metacognitive skills, like, for example, development of a more flexible mindset or meaning-making or meaning-finding, etc., things like this. So basically, Spark is a framework that enables us to understand what's going on and at the same time enables us to learn associated skills. And not everybody would need all of the skills because some skills might be just completely natural to you. But it's about also pinpointing and understanding what skills would really make a difference for you.
Well, super helpful because I think many people have a very hard time again to actually apprehend what resiliency is all about and making sense of that for themselves and giving them some practical tools to actually somehow manage that is quite critical, I think.
Very important at the moment, absolutely.
You know, we've been talking about well-being and engagement, of course, but increasingly people want more than that. They want more than well-being. They want to find a purpose in their jobs, in their lives, actually. So they are seeking happiness. And I know you've defined happiness, it's part also of a lot of literature existing on that, as the combination of hedonism and eudaimonia. I know this is a challenging word, by the way. Can you elaborate on the definition of different meanings of happiness and elaborate on those terms, of course, and particularly as well in different cultures, like American and French, maybe? Because I've been living in those kind of two civilizations worlds myself for many years of my life, and I can see the sensitivity and the variances we have in apprehending that, actually.
Of course. That's a really complex question. So let's start with definitions.
Definition, yes, first.
So we're talking very often about hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. So hedonic well-being or happiness, in fact. Sometimes we use happiness, sometimes well-being, and I'll come back to that. Okay. So this is really fundamentally about feeling good, feeling well. So being satisfied with our lives, so the cognitive component, and having more positive emotions and negative emotions, so the emotional component. So that's one part, and this is is really where we have most of research on happiness and well-being is in using this particular definition. So when we are comparing different countries, for example, we will be comparing them and saying that Denmark, for example, is happier than France.
Happiest country in the world, etc.
Exactly, one of their, sometimes it's Iceland, sometimes it's Finland, sometimes etc. They keep competing. Okay? So depending on the year. So that we will be using this hedonic well-being definition, subjective well-being definition, another name for it, to measure. Then there is another component to well-being, and this is really a component influenced originally by philosophical literature. So we're talking about eudaimonia. So what's eudaimonia? It's, if you translate directly, it's kind of good spirit. And there is a slight distinction between what Aristotle meant by eudaimonia and what we mean nowadays. What we mean nowadays by this notion of eudaimonic well-being, it's really about going beyond just feeling good. It's not just about waking up in the morning and feeling good in your body or looking forward to the day. It's about something beyond yourself. So really there are two major components, I would say, to that. One is really self-actualization. So going further, going beyond, stretching yourself. So sort of transcendent, almost of self-transcendent tendency.
Fulfilling yourself as well.
Exactly, fulfilling yourself. And another one is really contribution. So it's doing something for others, for the world.
For the world.
In fact, of course, there are many more components to it, and there is a whole big book written or edited on the subject matter with different definitions, but I would usually stick to these two. And there is a big difference between these two, hedonic and eudaimonic, because one is about fundamentally homeostatic well-being. And another one is about breaking that homeostasis. And in the moment of breaking homeostasis, you might not be feeling that particularly good, but at the same time it feels meaningful. And so your question about different, I would say, interpretations of these notions in different cultures. I would say eudaimonic well-being, there aren't that many sort of issues in interpretation because it's a very new notion to the vast majority of people. So people, I would say, kind of take it for granted, the scientific interpretation. But of course, when I talk about hedonic well-being, there are many words we would use naturally. Well-being, subjective well-being, happiness, etc. And if you just stay to kind of at the level of this words, well-being and happiness, in fact, they don't necessarily mean the same in different languages. So, for example, if I speak English, if you compare well-being and happiness, well-being is this kind of really big notion, right? And if you type well-being on Google, for example, you would actually see lots and lots of models, especially subjective well-being or something, or hedonic well-being, lots and lots of different models. It's a very sort of encompassing notion. And happiness is more associated with this hedonic state, feeling happy, feeling feeling happy, feeling well in yourself. In English, if we switch to French, something else happens. So we will type bien-être, for example. And we just look at the images associated. What will we see? We'll see relaxation, massage, a bit of meditation. So the notion of bien-être is a much more hedonic notion, right? And the notion of happiness, bonheur, it's a far more complex philosophical notion, very often put forward, right?
Completely.
So even those two very small differences already highlight something. And I can bring some other languages into the story. If I add well-being in Russian, for example, that would be благополучие. And this is a notion which is very often associated with material well-being, far more than just emotional well-being, etc.
Spirituality, etc.
And I keep playing with these notions in all different languages, and very often finding that what we mean by them just really is quite different across the globe.
No, that's amazing. I've been spending many years of my life as well working with global international teams from all over the world, and I've been always fascinated by how much we can be lost in translation in some basic word that seems simple but actually mean very different things to people. So talking about happiness, you're involved in a very special and very exciting project with the government of Bhutan, a nation which has a unique approach to happiness and which developed the idea of a gross national happiness, so the GNP for happiness, to guide the government. So what did you learn from this incredible project?
Yeah, that was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating invention. I learned so much from it. It was a couple of years back, already a few years back, and I was not involved in defining the gross national happiness concept. That was already well defined because it is the first country that defined and measures well-being at the level of population. However, I was involved in bringing together a group of international experts and producing a report for the United Nations on how this notion of happiness and well-being from Bhutan can actually inform public policy across the world.
Yes.
So I've been really working specifically on the development of public policy recommendations based on this project. And what did I learn? Well, probably the basic thing, the most interesting, is the whole notion of sustainable happiness that we can actually we get from Bhutan. What's sustainable happiness? Okay, it makes sense, right?
Yeah,
because
of course,
sustainable for the individual and sustainable for whom? For the planet.
Yeah.
Because if there is no notion of sustainability, well, there will not be happiness.
Yeah.
In a very
close
future, in fact.
For sure,
so the whole notion of sustainable happiness, and they were really the country that advocate the concept and bring it to the attention of the United Nations, that sustainability and happiness, in fact, are not contrasting notions, that notions have to work hand in hand. Sustainable for whom? Sustainable for the human beings, sustainable for the planet, in order to also be sustainable for the human beings. And of course, there is another kind of level and layer of the sustainable well-being. It's also how do we sustain well-being, what are the means we can use for ourselves to sustain well-being in ourselves. So that brings us to the whole notion of skills and competences to develop, etc., and lots of discipline. And another point that I learned is that the importance, in fact, of public policy, organizational policy, and by very simply putting some relatively straightforward rules in place or policies in place, we can really facilitate and change those well-being conditions for the individual. So that's another important learning, I would say.
No, it's an amazing discussion. We could go on and on this one, because when you think about, of course, climate change, and you think about now many countries in the West, finding out that indeed the people who are going to suffer the most are all those countries in the South, the concept of sustainable happiness makes tons of sense. And I think we have to reflect on that.
Absolutely.
No, Ilona, coming to an end, so last couple of questions. Talking about cultural sensitivity, we discussed about, and you've been someone, I must say, people don't know, but you were born in Latvia, and you have some Russian roots, but you've been living many years in the UK, in France as well. You've lived in many other places in the world as well. So you've been pretty global as a citizen. So I must admit that when I talk myself about positive psychology, positive leadership in my home country in France, and I would say in Europe as well, pretty much in many countries in Europe, I hear some skepticism on how rosy, idealistic this leadership philosophy theory is, and that it does not address, the real tough problems you have to address in the business world as a manager, tough moments where you have to, make tough decisions. Actually, my own experience has shown me that a truly positive leader, can do a much better job than a conventional leader addressing the toughest situations in the business life. So can you help us debunk this myth of positive psychology, positive leadership being not actually relevant for business issues?
Well, I think it very much depends on how you define positive leadership.
Yes.
And what model you would take as a core. So, for example, we can take some of the sort of most traditional models of positive leadership and focus on the positive relationship and positive climate, for example, and positive communication, which is great. And here it's really all positive. In fact, it's more complicated than that, of course, but it just sounds very positive. And sometimes when they bring this concept, leaders are petrified. It's like, okay, listen, sometimes I need to fire somebody, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes I need to make cuts.
Yeah.
Sometimes I need to make credit. So it's positive, yes, I can express it in a positive way, but that just does not go far enough for me.
Yeah.
So there is another notion of positive leadership out there very often used in terms of positive leadership is about, and that's a model we've developed with Evgeny Osin, is about fundamentally really sort of tightening up and developing your own personal resources, but also your resources as a motivator. Via which means do you motivate?
Yes.
How do you motivate using intrinsic means, meaning relationships and mastery and meaning, for example, rather than extrinsic means? That's another level. And then perhaps there is another layer, and that's my leadership model that I really prefer positive leadership model. And this one comes from Bob Quinn. And he's talking about positive leadership is fundamentally being able to manage contrasting tensions.
Yes.
Very interesting model, very different, in fact, because it means that positive is not just about being nice.
No.
It's about being able to hold things which are contradictory.
Yes.
So growth and stability, for example.
Yes.
Creativity and procedural compliance.
Yes.
Audacity and humility.
Yes.
And being able to speak both of these languages.
Absolutely.
And most as if really positive, what means positive is being able to speak the language of tradition rather than throw it in a bin.
Yes.
And everything that we know from the hard management science.
Yes.
And at the same time speak and use the language of modernity, meaning creativity and openness to opinion, involving others, coaching conversation, etc. And being able to bring these two together. Both being positive, in fact.
Yes.
And the positive being also the outcome of balancing those contradictory tensions.
Yes.
And in fact, all of these positives can become negative if taken too far.
Yeah.
So creativity taken too far becomes chaos.
Yes. Yes.
Or organizational compliance taken too far
bureaucracy
becomes bureaucracy,
Yeah.
etc. So it's about being able to hold, integrate, and use this sort of competing positions.
Yes.
And that's what positive leadership is about. And when I bring this notion of holding those tensions, contrasting tensions, somehow everything in the room changes.
Yes.
And somehow every single leader I've ever spoken to or presented this model to just said, that's exactly what I seem to be doing
dealing with
most of the time is holding those contrasting tensions.
Yes.
But also being aware when I'm going in the overdrive.
Too far.
This way or that way.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. I think it's great that you addressed that elephant in a room because it's there. And I think indeed that authenticity you can bring yourself as a leader in those tough moments, which happen all the time, by the way, in a business life, in personal lives as well, is super critical in building on the strengths of others, yourself, and making sense situation collectively to stay aligned on whatever is the purpose, the North Star of the organization of that team. But positivity is not just about being a nice person in a room. Not. No, last question. An important one for all the listeners, I guess, Ilona. What role do you see, positive psychology coaching will be having in the workplace in the future, and what would be the advice you give to all of the listeners to take a first step in their lives to embrace it? Where do we start with that? To close the dialogue.
That's a big question.
I know, but I know that.
I think. Sorry.
Yes. No. Good.
I think in the current very transformative period of time that we are living in, positive psychology coaching and positive psychology-based training are incredibly important. Absolutely. And I think they will be still playing a very important, significant role in years to come.
Yeah.
However, it is not about discarding other ways of coaching or other ways of training, but rather about integrating. Because positive psychology coaching is appropriate for some specific questions, for some specific outcomes. So when we're dealing with resilience, when we're dealing with engagement, when we're dealing with well-being, or even with meaning, which is like really the core question, I think both positive psychology coaching and positive psychology training can really provide us with huge amount of tools, resources, scientific understanding, because we haven't really talked about the science, but all of those tools and practices and models are science-based, which is pretty important, right? If you really want to kind of try sort of test and learn from this experience. So in order to address these type of questions, this type of worker questions, positive psychology coaching and training would be extremely appropriate. And where to start? Well, where to start? I think start by reading. Start by reading critically.
Yes.
So start by reading beyond the pop books. If you're actually coming across an interpretation of research, look at perhaps alternative interpretation. So to try digging as well. Because positive psychology, what's beautiful about this subject matter and why I'm still really, really passionate about it, it is a scientific discipline. Scientific discipline means the conclusions can be questioned.
Yeah.
They can be challenged.
Yeah.
And sometimes they actually can be flipped upside down with the new science arising. So which is why I think the first starting point is to read critically, to go to the bottom of the information, to look for scientific publications, and of course then bring it back and experiment. Because of course there are two levels, many more levels, but at least two levels of integration of information. One is the cognitive level, another one is experiential, of course. So read and play. That would be my conclusion.
That's a wonderful closing, I think, Ilona, and thank you so much for having played with me with some cards, but also having done a fantastic job of walking all of our listeners on this wonderful trajectory and travel you've been having yourselves. And I also want to thank Martin Seligman for having this cup of coffee with you a few years back and asking you that precise question that got you here today. So thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.